Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, editorial consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. At IGPP Expert Talks, AI special series, we're discussing AI and its societal impacts. We many a time stumble upon the phrase responsible AI. But how can a technology be made responsible? Should future innovations have aspects of accountability embedded in them? Today, we ask these questions to Professor Bernd Stahl. Professor Bernd Stahl is the Professor of Critical Research in Technology at the School of Computer Science, University of Nottingham. He also serves as the chair of the School of Computer Science Research Ethics Committee and the Cross-University AI in Research and Knowledge Exchange Group. In addition, he is a member of the University Research Integrity and Ethics Committee. His research focuses on ethical and social implications of digital technologies, and he has published extensively on the concept and practice of responsible innovation. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you, Heena. Thank you for welcoming me.
You've written extensively about responsible innovation, a term which is often loosely used in the tech world without a complete understanding of what it truly means. Given your research on the embedded responsibility in social technical systems, could you begin by explaining what does the term responsible innovation mean, especially in the context of AI? Is it simply about fairness, non-discrimination, avoiding misuse, and protecting privacy, or does it go beyond it?
So when I use the term responsible innovation, sometimes I use synonymously the term responsible research and innovation. I refer to the academic discourse around those topics. And in that discourse, the term is actually fairly clearly defined. I think one way of representing it would be to say that responsible innovation is about ensuring that research and its outcomes are desirable, acceptable, and sustainable. And that means we're looking at both the research process, so how do we go about doing the research, but also the outcomes, the products, whatever the consequences are that arise from this. So it's in this academic context, is very much framed around ensuring a fit between societal needs and preferences and the development of technology. So that's in a nutshell what responsible innovation means to me. And that can be applied to pretty much any type of research, any type of technical research, but also social science research, humanities research. We can apply it to anything, including, of course, AI. And if you look at the meaning it may have in the AI discourse, the topics that you touched on, such as fairness, non-discrimination, avoiding misuse, and so on, play a role. They're important. But it's certainly a lot broader than that. It is about thinking about what AI could do in the world, how we can live a collective better life in societies with the use of technology. So it's much broader than those particular issues.
In your paper, Embedding Responsibility in Intelligent Systems, you propose two approaches to embedded responsibility: the ecosystem approach and the concept of meta-responsibility. Could you please elaborate on these ideas and explain why you believe it is important to embed responsibility in intelligent systems? And how do you envision these ideas being put into applications in real-world AI development and deployment?
Right. So these two ideas of responsible AI ecosystems and meta-responsibility, they're actually related. They're not completely separate. And they both start with the recognition that the locus of responsibility, so the place where responsibility is allocated, is not, or at least not exclusively, a particular piece of technology, a particular individual, or a particular organization, but it is something that's diffused more broadly through the socio-technical system. And the term ecosystem is used very widely with regards to AI. So there's lots of research programs around ecosystem. A lot of policy use the term AI ecosystem. So in the UK, certainly the national AI policy is very heavily predicated on improving the UK AI ecosystem. So I've adopted that term and tried to think through what does it mean in practice in terms of implementing ethical questions or thinking through or embedding ethical questions in the AI development process. So the reason why I think this is important is that it moves the focus of discussion away from the individual piece of kit or the individual developer or the individual company, and looks at how the piece of kit or the developer or the company are embedded in the broader social system, economic system, legal system, and how those systems influence what they can and should and would want to do. So that's the idea behind this responsible AI ecosystem. It's taking a systems approach, being aware that interactions within systems are often complex, very often non-determined. There are very rarely linear causalities. You can't say, I did this and therefore this happened and this happened. The outcomes tend to be much more convoluted. Many influencing factors fit in there. So it's a way, or responsible AI ecosystem as a term aims to move away from simplistic assumptions about what ethics is and how it can be realized. So that's the ecosystems. With the other term that you mentioned is this idea of meta responsibility. And meta responsibility is also predicated on the recognition that we live in, all of us, human beings, always live in complex social systems. Even if we just live in a Stone Age tribe, there are complexities in the relationships we have with our fellow human beings and with our environment. In modern societies, we all have lots of responsibilities already. Everybody has. You grow up, you grow into them, you're socialized into them. You cannot escape them. You have responsibilities as a parent, as a professional, as a teacher, as a student, as a citizen, as somebody who participates in traffic. Loads of them. Most of them we are aware of, at least loosely. Some of them we may not be very clear about. And the idea of meta responsibility aims to recognize that these responsibilities exist. AI does not get put into a vacuum. It gets implemented in societies, in existing social situations. And for me, the additional responsibilities that AI calls for to make sure that it is unbiased, that it doesn't hurt people, that it safeguards people and so on, they only make sense to think about in this context of already existing responsibilities. Existing many different roles that exist. So this goes back to this ecosystem idea. So you have already existing law enforcement mechanisms, you have cultural preferences, you have all sorts of things that already exist. In order for AI-related responsibilities to be effective, they need to be embedded in this broader system of systems, in the existing landscape or network of responsibilities. And that's the idea of meta responsibility, or that's where it comes from. In order for this to be successful, those existing responsibilities have to be aligned. They have to be shaped in a way that is conducive to being sensitive to what AI does, to possible consequences. So meta responsibility is an attempt to think about a higher level of responsibility that doesn't just create new responsibilities, but that tries to align existing responsibilities and new responsibilities with a view to achieving a shared intended outcome, such as a more desirable, more acceptable type of technology that actually helps people to flourish. So that's meta responsibility. It's the idea to go a step above responsibility, hence the meta, above existing responsibilities and bring those together and align them.
I have a sort of naive question, if you allow me, with the concept of meta responsibility. Each individual institution would have multiple responsibility. A government's responsibility would be to ensure that its citizens have employment and are taken care of, or their overall welfare being the responsibility of the government. But the responsibility of a tech corporate, a tycoon, can be to increase the profits of their company and increase the productivity of their workers, right? Now with AI, we have this threat that jobs will be somewhat replaced. There would be some displacement, if not all. right? And as companies are increasingly adopting AI-related technologies, we are seeing that in India, for example, companies adopting AI technology has impacts on it. For example, IT sector, and people are losing jobs. So how do we ensure responsible innovation then, or how do we ensure responsible AI then? Because there are two responsibilities of two people. One is more human, one is more capitalistic, let's say. When there's such a conflict, what would responsible AI mean?
Yeah, well, that's of course not just an AI problem. Right? That's a problem of increasing productivity, which will lead to a reduction in employment. So I think the reason why this ecosystems approach to me makes sense is that it can cater to exactly the sort of question you're asking. So we are looking at existing ecosystems, and those ecosystems are not just AI, they are other systems, and AI sits in that. And the example you give, the question of looking after people who lose their jobs, I think is a nice one where we can say, well, I know very little about India. But if I look at European countries, we have social security systems in place that are supposed to help people who go through this sort of process, who lose their job because their job no longer needs to be done. And the idea is that firstly, we make sure that they don't starve to death. So there's a certain level of social security to look after them. But it goes beyond that. And it's also trying to think about how we can ensure that people can remain integrated in society. So that then goes to things like training. So if you become unemployed because your skills are no longer required, typically the states in European countries offer you ways of escaping that. So they offer you training opportunities, they offer you other types of support. So that's a classically existing responsibility structure, which now is independent of AI, but which may well be very useful in the world of AI. Now, how does that relate to your tech company whose responsibility is to maximize its profit? Now, I would doubt whether that is actually true. I would say that saying that a company is only there to maximize profits is probably a bit undercomplex. They are more complicated than that. Well, let's just assume for the sake of the argument that that's what they do. Then I think the overarching question is, well, how can the societal responsibility to look after people be squared with the organizational responsibility to increase its profits? And I think that's actually a fairly straightforward question with a very simple answer, namely taxation. Society says we have to look after our people. You company, you do something which has consequences, and those consequences need to be looked after, and you are capable of doing so, so give us a bit of money, right? Or a lot of money. So I think that existing political structures are very much geared towards dealing with this sort of question. And that's, I think, how it should be. That's the way it works. I think the interesting question is where AI then leads to new problems, things that we haven't already got existing structures for, or where it exacerbates. So if it actually does become true that, for example, there was a big figure of, I think, 2 million drivers, jobs related to driving, taxi drivers, truck drivers, and so on, just in America were going to be lost. I don't think they have been lost yet. But if that happens, so if it changes the scale of the problem, then the question is, how can existing responsibilities, existing structures of responsibility deal with this sort of question? And that, I think, is a question that has ethical connotations, but in the end, it's a political one. It's a question of how societies deal with that. And I think the existing structures of society that exist, things like taxation, but also I think the legal system, liability, accountability, those are all aspects that can help contribute to the resolution of those problems. The question is how best to do that.
Your paper also creatively applies Gibson's and Norman's notion of affordance to AI, particularly in relation to ChatGPT. Could you explain the difference between affordance as perception and affordance as relational property of user artifact pair? And are there examples where affordance create ethical concerns, though like the application or underlying code may appear neutral or value agnostic?
Right. To answer the first part of the question, I probably need to say a little bit about affordances. So what's this? Why do we care? And to me, the concept of affordances was brought into the discourse because of the problem of technical determinism versus complete freedom. So if we have a piece of tech, and that doesn't have to be a piece of high tech, it can be anything in our environment. It can just be a rock, right? Then the question is, what are the properties of that piece of tech? So what can it do? So for example, you can, if you have a gun, you can shoot with it. But are the consequences, well, are the uses of a technology and the possible consequences of that, are they embedded in the piece of kit itself, or are they separate from it? And that's a really difficult philosophical question. And the concept of affordances aims to give an answer to that by saying that what you can do with a piece of tech is part of the relationship between the human user and the technology. And the example that Gibson uses, and that is widely used, which I think makes a lot of sense, is the affordance of sitting on. So there's something that you can sit on. If you think about a chair, you see a chair and you immediately recognize that you can sit on it. Now, it has an affordance of sitting on. But of course, there are many other things that have a similar affordance. So it might be a rock, or it might be a log in the jungle, or whatever. There are lots of things you can sit on. But then again, there are also possibly chairs that you look at and that you can't sit on because it's too big or too small for you, or it's too weak. So the concept of affordance tries to answer the question of what can I do, and where does this ability to do something with a piece of technology rest? Is it in the technology? And affordance says, no, it's not just in the technology, it's in the relationship between the technology and the individual. So that's my understanding of affordance. Now, what I've tried to do in this paper you refer to is to look at what are those affordances and bring this back to the ecosystems concept that we talked about earlier. And my argument in that paper is that affordances need to be looked at in the context of the ecosystems in which they play out. And the example I think I give in the paper, which is maybe easier to follow than some of the high-tech one, is the bicycle. Right? A bicycle has an affordance of locomotion. To me, when I see a bicycle, I know I can sit on it, I can pedal with it, and I can go somewhere. So that's the affordance, is to go somewhere. Again, that affordance does not necessarily work out. So I may not be able to ride a bicycle, or it also might not work for me if I were from the Stone Age. I see a bicycle, I have no idea what it is. It would make no sense to me. I couldn't ride it unless somebody told me what it is. And the argument I try to put forward with regards to the ecosystem is, well, you actually need to look beyond the relationship between the individual and the piece of tech. You need to look at what is the environment like that allows the tech to be used for particular purposes, right? And the bicycle is a nice example because the bicycle doesn't just, or it only offers you the affordance of locomotion if you have things like roads, right? If stuck with a bicycle in the middle of a swamp, it doesn't do anything for you, right? And similarly, the use of AI will require an understanding of the context in which you live. It requires an understanding of the ecosystem in which it is embedded and in which it unfolds. So that's where I think this idea of affordance is important. It helps you think about the relationship between the kit, the individual, and the socio-technical environment. And an example that I think is possibly useful is the affordance of cheating in essays. Now that's a big topic that came up as soon as ChatGPT was launched. All our students are now going to write all of their essays using ChatGPT, which may in fact be true. But of course, that the framing of that problem very much depends on the ecosystem that you live in. So this framing that I've just given is a typical higher education from a Western perspective reading of the affordance of ChatGPT, and that makes a lot of assumptions that are probably worth unpacking. So it makes the assumption that it's worthwhile testing students' knowledge through essays, that this is an appropriate way of understanding what they know and what they can't know, and that assumes that you have an understanding of why universities test in the first place. which I think is not generally widely discussed and agreed on. But arguably, one of the things that universities and marks in universities do is they rank people, they sort, they are part of social sorting. Now, they give an indication of who's going to go and get the top jobs and who's going to get stuck in the middle management. So in order to understand whether the use of ChatGPT for writing essays in universities is a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing, you need to think about the context in which this happens. You need to think about the ecosystem. And that was the point of the essay I was trying to make. So you need to unpack the logics of the ecosystem in order to be able to assess whether something is desirable, acceptable, or not.
The affordance, and I'm just like, maybe this is again a very naive question, but can we see the affordance of AI system or Gen AI applications like ChatGPT in terms of also in the terms of their environmental cost, like the
Absolutely, yeah. I mean that is part of the socio-technical ecosystem that they sit in, and it is at this point, I guess, very widely recognized that the environmental consequences of AI are significant. The amount of electricity that's used for it are huge, and there's a very interesting question of how we balance the benefits versus those costs. Because I mean, I'm deeply fascinated by ChatGPT and Gemini and all these generative AI systems, and I'm really flabbergasted by what they can do, and I use them happily. But at the same time, I actually don't think that what they do is worth degradation of the environment. When you hear discussions that private companies in America now want to build their own nuclear power stations to run their data centers, I say, that to me is a trade-off that's not obvious. No, I'm not convinced that producing more plutonium on this world, that's still going to be poisonous in 100,000 years. Whether that is a good way of providing the necessary energy for the next iteration of ChatGPT 4.52, right? So I think there are difficult, again, political questions to be asked, and the environmental side is clearly a very prominent one at this point.
I'm convinced with all that I'm reading on AI that the current use of AI that we are making is sort of really unnecessary, and the cost on environment is particularly high. I mean, you look at students searching for essays on ChatGPT or like getting essays fully formed on ChatGPT. And on one hand, they are losing their skills they would have otherwise put into application. And on the other hand, just the environmental cost of it is too high.
Yeah, I would have a lot of sympathy for that position. And I think the root cause of that, is it the root, maybe not the root cause, but one of the reasons why we've come to this point where we are now seeing uses of those foundation models and large language models, which are not very convincing, but they're still happening. I think it has to do with a lack of allocation of responsibility. So I think that there's a lack of liability and a lack of accountability. And the reason for that is the way that the entire IT world is currently structured. So you may remember the good old days when, if you wanted to have internet, you needed to pay for the for the amount of data you downloaded. That to me made some sense, and that I think is a traditional capitalist way of allocating responsibilities. Now that doesn't work in the current online world anymore at all. So you don't pay for what you use. The entire financial streams are completely different. It's all financed through marketing or through venture capitalists. I mean, ChatGPT or OpenAI, I don't think ever has made a penny of profit, but they're still managing to collect billions. And if I get it right, they want to get $1 trillion together to build the next big boom. And the reason why that's possible is that people simply don't have to pay for what they cost. It's a little bit like giving everybody a car and nobody has to pay for the petrol anymore. Of course, consumption would go up. Right? If you got people to pay for what they use, they would think about it more carefully. And that would probably lead to a much better use of allocation, or much better allocation of resources. Let's put it that way.
To that note is my next question, that who do we fix accountability on, responsibility upon? Because usually it's the technology professionals, developer, data scientists, engineers that are often held responsible when things go south. To what extent, for example, even in matters of Gen application, Gen AI giving wrong information, or misleading people, misleading voters, especially, that was a big issue. To what extent is it fair to place the burden of accountability solely on technology developers, given that systems like Grok challenge traditional distinctions between your publisher, intermediaries? So how do we fix responsibility, and where?
Yeah, well, it's of course a difficult question. I would disagree with the premise of your question. I don't think we hold individual developers responsible for the consequences of what's happening because of the work they do. And I beg you to give me a single example of a developer who's gone to jail because the technology that they've produced has had some terrible consequences. That happens in the offline world. If you're an engineer and you build a bridge and the bridge collapses because you didn't do your job properly, you may be held liable. I'm not aware of that happening anywhere in the online world, in the tech world. And I think that there's an interesting question as to why that is the case. And I think it has a lot to do with the original culture coming up in the computer science or applied computing world from the 1980s, from when Microsoft was started, and the fact that the software world has always been very good at sidestepping liability. When your car breaks down, you go to your car dealer and complain, and you get a courtesy car. When your computer breaks down, you go to your local computer shop and says, "Well, tough luck. You've signed away your rights in the shrink wrap license." And I think that's a history of 30, 40 years at this point, where the software world simply has not accepted liability for anything it does. And it continues to very successfully do that. And it continues to very successfully lobby for that not to change. But I think that should change. And I think that's my core answer to your question. We need to find ways of allocating liability, legal liability, but also moral responsibility onto the producer of the technology who benefit from it. And that's, in most cases, not the individual developer. That would be the organization. So I think we need to find ways of holding the organization responsible. So if something goes wrong because of your social network, because of your generative AI system, then the provider of that system should be held liable. I would, and given that at this point, what is it? I think 6 of the 7 largest companies in the world with a market capitalization of more than $1 trillion are software, IT, online companies. I think they can now shoulder that burden. I mean, one of the reasons why initially I think societies were careful to not overload companies, software companies, with liability was that they said, we're very fragile, we don't make a penny. If we are held liable for stuff, then we're going to go bankrupt. Those days are over. Not at all anymore. That doesn't exist anymore. They are the political power, the political and economic power of the world right now. And I think what we would need is a way of strengthening liabilities. I would go so far as to say that software-related organizations, and that to me includes social media, but also AI companies, should probably be held strictly liable. That means that the default assumption should be that it's their fault, and they should provide redress if something goes wrong. And they would need to prove that they are innocent, or that they've put stuff in place to avoid harm. If it did that, I think the whole debate would change. If you, as a student, cheating on your essay, fail your essay because ChatGPT has hallucinated an answer that was simply wrong, you should be able to go back to OpenAI and say, no, I just failed this module because of you. You owe me money. If that happened, it would all look very different. Right? Now, I think conceptually that to me is the way to go. I think politically this would be extremely difficult, not just because the Trump administration would not even dream about any of that, but even in other systems and post-Trump, the entrenched power of the tech world is such that they would be very strongly opposing that. It would be very difficult to make changes in that direction. Having said that, I mean, there are attempts to do this on the European level. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, are attempts to go in that direction, to hold companies more liable, more responsible for the consequences of what they're doing.
I mean, students will fail exam not because ChatGPT hallucinated, because the teacher probably realized that all the answers were one and the same. There are more chances of that happening. Finally, you advocate a tentative reflexive governance, which is one very important dimension of responsible innovation, alongside others such as deliberation, participation, anticipation, and responsiveness. Could you please share an example of an experimental policy or regulatory intervention that you would like to see piloted in the AI space?
Yes, exactly. My answer to your previous question is my answer to this one. I think it would be, I mean, tentative governance is about being careful about looking at existing structures and not breaking everything at the same time, but testing out, working with people to see what works, what doesn't work. Being careful, being able to learn. So it's about ensuring that any changes that we see are reflected and considered before we put them in practice, right? But the one thing, as I said earlier, that I think is really missing is this liability link. So I'm talking about legal liability, but I think it covers other aspects of responsibility. So I think there's a case to be made that maybe we should hold individual developers more responsible through, for example, professional responsibility. At this point, a lot of professional bodies have codes of ethics in place, but it's very difficult. Or those tend to apply to areas of misuse. So if you cheat your customer, or if you or if as a professional you act in a way that violates the professional norms, in the sense that you do dishonest things, professional bodies will prosecute you in whatever way they do that. But if you do your job and the consequences of your job are atrocious, so if you work for a defense contractor and they build a new weapon system that kills hundreds of innocent civilians, nobody holds you responsible. And I think maybe we should move beyond that, not just in terms of legal liability, as I said earlier, but also in terms of professional responsibility, maybe moral responsibility. Maybe there would be societal discourses to be had about blaming companies or individuals for consequences, which currently doesn't happen, or only to a limited degree. But that would be if I had a sandbox, one of those sandboxes where you can play around with bits of society, I would say, well, let's just see what would happen if we did put in strict liability for, let's say, social media companies, right, who use AI heavily in lots of different ways. Let's see how the dynamics would change if people could actually sue Facebook because of something that happened on their website, for example, because something that an algorithm suggested. And there are lots and lots of examples of things going wrong because of social media and because of recommender systems in social media. What if we could just hold the company immediately responsible? That would be a lovely experiment. I'm not sure whether that's possible as a sort of a sandbox activity, but that's something I would really be interested in.
I also have one policy proposal, and you tell me if one can even think on those lines or not. And my proposal is that for countries like India, where we have lots of labor and lots of people who are in need of employment, companies that are adopting AI technologies, there should be a cap on it of some sort. Like, you cannot maybe adopt AI in all your functions, and you cannot replace all human laborers with AI applications, or you cannot automate everything. Or if you have a company of, say, certain millions, then you necessarily need to employ at least a certain number of people. Do you think that would work? Or
I think, well, I think you could think of anything, right? And I think it would have the advantage that it sort of creates an immediate link between the use of AI and employment. And given that a lot of people are worried about employment, that might satisfy people. I'm skeptical about whether this would be a long-term solution. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that I don't think AI replaces people. None of the AI systems we have at the moment do that. I think AI does, it changes the way we work. So it's not like anybody. I mean, we now talk of AI employees and so on, which I think is complete nonsense. It doesn't exist. But what I think in practice tends to happen is that AI can be very useful in supporting and supplementing what people do. In the best case, AI can lead to us being more productive. And being productive is something that we generally accept as a good thing. But we also know that increases of productivity means decreases in employment if everything remains the same. So even in the best case, it would have the consequence. And then the question is, how do we deal with this consequence? And one solution is the one you suggested, i.e. the company needs to sort it out. They need to make sure that they have a certain level of employment. That's possible. It might work if this were to be a sort of global policy. It probably won't work if we stay in the international competitive system that we are, because it would mean that the company that has to do that will incur higher costs, and therefore their prices will go up and they'll become less competitive. So I think as long as we are in this competitive capitalist environment, I'm not very optimistic it would work. But what I do think might work is a sort of AI tax, where we say, well, now if you generate, and it doesn't have to be an AI tax, you can just increase income taxes. Now, if you make a profit, you owe to society, and a certain amount of that money is used to alleviate the consequences of unemployment that is caused by technology, by productivity increases. And that goes back to what I said very early on. This is what social welfare states do anyway. They don't necessarily do it particularly well, but I think that they probably could do it better. And we can't train up every truck driver who doesn't drive a truck anymore. Even though I still don't think there is a single truck driver who's lost his job because of AI at this point. But even if there were, we probably can't train them all to become AI experts, which is sort of the tech view of the world. But maybe there are other ways of finding useful employment for them, and also of structuring social security systems so that people can lead a meaningful life. Because that's really what it comes down to, right? So we want to make sure that every human being can lead a good life, that they can flourish in whichever way that's possible for them. And I think AI, if it leads to productivity gains, can certainly contribute to that. If you look back to the Marxist utopias of the early 20th century, the idea is that we would all work 15 hours a week, and everything else would be taken care of by machines. Now, I think, to me, that still sounds pretty utopian, and maybe AI can get us there, right? I would be perfectly happy to only work 15 hours a week. I don't want to not work at all. I want to work a little bit, but I certainly would like to work a lot less than I do at the moment. And if AI could facilitate that for all of us, that would be great, right? The problem is that at the moment, we have this economic inequality, always continuously growing economic equality between the few people who get filthy rich and the vast majority who have very little to nothing. And I think the problem is not so much AI and productivity. The problem is this imbalance in distribution. And that's a big political problem. And that's what we as humanity need to find a way of solving. I see no progress in that whatsoever in practice, but that's, I think, our moral challenge.
Thank you for joining us, sir. This was a very enlightening discussion.